Welcome everybody to Salary Negotiation. We really appreciate you all joining us on this lovely day. My name is Charisse. I am an instructor and research specialist at the Central Branch. And we do have closed captions enabled. You can look along your bottom toolbar and disable that if it's distracting to you. They are automatically generated by Zoom, so there may be some errors. We are also recording this session. I also want to invite you, please, to check out our classes and events page. We have some fantastic classes coming up. We have a 3-part class taught by a Howard County teacher called Community Spirit Despite Unequal Resources. And it's about the segregated education of Blacks in the Howard County Public School System, 1935 to 1965. The first one is next Tuesday, June 8th at 7 p.m. And we're all really excited for this series. I will put a link to sign up in the chat. Please use the chat if you're having any technical issues. And please use the Q&A if you have any questions. I will be monitoring the questions for our speaker today. Now, I'm very excited to introduce Jayne Kaiser. Jayne has a varied background in education, finance, and training, and has been a small business owner for over 20 years. For the past 8 years, she has worked with the Departments of Labor and Defense, assisting military service members as they leave the military and seek employment in the civilian sector. Please join me in welcoming Jayne, and I will send it over to you.
Oops, there we go. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You need
Okay.
to.
I'm going to turn my camera on here too. There we go.
Yes,
Buddy.
excellent Zoom behavior.
Thank you, Charisse. And welcome everyone to the workshop. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It is very near and dear to my heart because I have worked with service members who I have seen what a difference it can make for having the skill set to be able to be paid what you are worth. And I deliberately chose that phrase for the title of this course. Many times we focus on what we need, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I really am passionate about everybody being paid what they are worth. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have some slides. They are really just to supplement what I'm going to talk about. I will be happy to share them at the end, but the bulk of tonight's workshop will actually be things that I'm telling you. And I would love for us to be able to dialogue back and forth as much as possible. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and Charisse will let me know because when I'm sharing my screen, I cannot see the chat box. So Charisse, I will depend on you for that. And we will go ahead and get started. So to begin with, a couple of you have already done this for me. If you will type in the chat box, is there anything specific that you would hope to gain by attending this workshop? And at the same time, also stick in the chat box, have you ever negotiated salary before? Is this a skill that you've already practiced a few times, or is this a skill that you're trying to attain so that you can negotiate? So I'll give you just a minute to put your comments in the chat box. Do we have any responses, Charisse?
We have, yes, I have negotiated, but my skills and sources of data are rusty.
Okay, great.
A previous comment was, I hope to gain better salary negotiation tips for current jobs.
Okay.
One person posted they've never negotiated before.
Okay, so we have some who have, but want to brush up on skills, and some new ones. So that's great. That just gives me an idea of where to go from here. So let's start with just doing a quick overview of what we're going to cover during this workshop. First of all, I want to show you how to determine market salary range. Most applications now ask you to give a salary range. And it used to be we could put in there negotiable or will discuss or, something a little ambiguous. But nowadays with online applications, most of them do demand that you put in an actual amount, a dollar amount. And while we like to talk about using a range, sometimes they don't even allow you to put in a range. You have to put in a fixed amount. So we're going to talk about how to determine what to put in that box on the application. Secondly, we want to talk about what you are worth. As I mentioned, it's not about how much you need, although that is obviously an important characteristic, and you will want to determine what is your bottom line that you can afford to accept. But we want to find out what you're worth. And so we'll go through some steps to do that. And then we're going to have a discussion about what is negotiable. There are some benefits that are negotiable and others that probably aren't. And so I want to give you some background on when you're going to the negotiating table, what are some factors to consider? And while you may not get the highest salary that you were looking for, are there other things that are just as valuable that you might want to consider asking for? And then finally, we'll talk about the rules for negotiating and how to go about that.
Some concerns here in the chat are that there's an issue of it being a sensitive topic, and that humbleness or shyness might get in the way. So those are some of the other concerns that have been raised in the chat.
I really appreciate you sharing that. And I will tell you, obviously I'm not 20 years old. You can see that from me being on screen. Until I took my job with the Department of Labor, which was 8 years ago, I had never negotiated salary. Now, I was a business owner for 20 years, so it wasn't like I was out interviewing. But prior to that, starting when I was, 18 at my first job, and up until probably my mid 30s, I was in corporate America. And honestly, I didn't want to have that conversation. So when they offered me a position, I worked at a university for a while. When they offered me a position, and frankly, it was more money than I'd ever made in my life, I was so excited. I said yes on the telephone when she called to make the offer. Now I've learned through working with a lot of recruiters and through the Department of Labor that I probably left somewhere between $10,000 to $15,000 on the table by not negotiating. And once I learned that, it made me a little more comfortable having the conversation. And what I hope you can leave with today is, one, the courage, which I think information will give you that courage, and two, the demeanor of how to have that conversation. And so, I don't know if the person who put that comment in was male or female. I will tell you, one of the factors is we know that women are paid less in the workforce than men are. We hear that, I don't know what it's at now, about 75 cents, 78 cents on the dollar, women to male. Part of that is because men are much more likely to negotiate than women are. Women are willing to accept what they're offered. Men typically will go back in and have that negotiating conversation. And so Regardless of your gender, I hope that you leave tonight a little bit more confident about saying, okay, I'm just going to take a deep breath, I'm going to prepare, and I'm going to have the conversation. So let's get started about looking at what is the definition of negotiating. And it's really pretty simple. Knowing what you want, going after it, and respecting the other person in the process. That is what negotiating is, whether it's for salary or for any other topic. It is a win-win for everybody. So the whole point is that of negotiating is that you look out for yourself, but you're also willing to give and budge on some of the factors in order to satisfy both parties. You want to build a professional relationship and not burn a bridge. I have seen people, I've been in organizations where people came in and they were really tough negotiators and they did not really respect the other people in the process. And sometimes because they were highly skilled, they were hired anyway, and they got everything that they were asking for. But what I observed going forward was the relationship suffered. They found walls going up when they were trying to do their job going forward. And what you don't want is to be that person who walks away from the table with everything you wanted, but every time you see the person you negotiated with, they have a bad taste in their mouth. And they're like, yeah, they really stuck it to me. You know, they weren't willing to budge. And so that's not a win-win. You want both sides to feel like they got a win out of the situation. And so that's going to be our goal during this workshop. So let's talk about market value. The first step in negotiating takes place when you are applying for the position, because whether they ask for it on the application or not, usually at the first interview, which is a screening interview, typically done over the phone, one of the first questions you'll be asked is, what is your salary range? There are a few ways to try and get around this. You can, or if they say, what are your salary needs? You can say, well, may I ask, has a range been established for the position? I can guarantee you it has been. Sometimes they will give it to you. Sometimes they won't. So you can try that. Try asking the question, has a salary range been established for the position? If they say, well, we'd like to know what your range is, then you're going to have to be prepared to give them one. Sometimes you can also say, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about the job because, you know, based on what I've read in the announcement, I have a range in mind, but I have some questions about the position. So it's okay to try and stall that conversation a little bit, but occasionally you will get a recruiter who says, I need your range. And if so, you want to make sure you've done your research, you're able to give a range, and you can also add at the end, but depending on when I get more information about the position, I reserve the right to adjust the range. And that kind of gives you an opening. You're also going to make the range big enough so that if you've underestimated the bottom, you've given yourself some grow room at the top. So let's talk about what market value is. It really answers the question, how much is your education, your knowledge, your skills, and your abilities worth when you are employed in a specific job in a particular location? And I will add one more factor to consider, and that is, what is the supply and demand situation? So let's look at a situation. Let's pick an example. You are moving to Omaha, Nebraska, and you are a marine biologist. Now, I happen to know this because one of my coworkers is from Omaha, and she looked this up. There is currently about 1 or 2 marine biologists employed in Omaha, Nebraska. So the supply is low, probably not a huge demand. And so they're probably not going to have to pay as high of wages as a marine biologist in San Diego, California, or in Baltimore, Maryland, or anywhere near the Chesapeake Bay. So the location is going to be important not only for supply and demand, but also for cost of living. The cost of living in Omaha is quite a bit lower than it is in San Diego or Baltimore for that matter. And so the wages are going to make a difference. And again, it depends on your level of education and the experiences, knowledge, skills, and abilities that you bring to you. And so the first thing to do is some research. I'm going to ask you to type in the chat box because I would prefer to use an example coming from you. If you want to type in your particular position that you're either in currently or looking to move into, if you would type the job title in the chat box, I will use that as one of my examples as I show you a site to use for researching salary. While you're doing that, I will stop sharing and go to the other.
We have a senior accountant.
Okay.
We have a director of business development. We have someone in an IT internship, a psychotherapist, a software engineer, a CFO for a medium-sized nonprofit.
Okay. Let me, let's see. I want to share this
A
one.
hospital sonographer as well.
Okay. I'm going to pick, the accountant was the first one, right?
Yes.
I think that would be a good one. So the website that I am using is called salary.com. This is a relatively, it's been around, but they've made some enhancements to it. And I'll talk about the other two that I have on the slide when we go back to that. But I'm going to start with salary.com. So let's put in our accountant here. And I'm going to pick Baltimore, since that is our closest large city. And we will get a salary estimate. And then there are a few things that we can do. Now, what I like about this is you can come down here and it, first of all, it gives you a job description and it has different layers. So here we have a plant accountant. Here's an accountant 2, entry level, junior, intermediate, and they don't have a senior. Okay, unusual, but for some reason, oh, wait, maybe we can, here we go. Here is a senior, okay. So it also allows you to do some comparisons. So if you had multiple positions, you could compare. We're just gonna look at one of them. It tells you some alternate job titles. So this could be a financial accountant 3, general accountant senior, and so forth. And then there is a description. So if you're not sure, like, you know, am I really a senior accountant? It tells you what you should be able to do. And it says this person should have been working in a related experience of 4 to 7 years. So let's go ahead and click on view salary. All right, so here is the little chart for us. At the low end, at the lowest 10%, it's 68,000, and at the high end, it's 101, and the median, which is at the 50% mark, is 83,990. Now, what I really like about this particular program is it allows you to tailor it a little bit more. And so over here on this side, they ask you, do you know the following factors can affect your pay? Check it out to see how much you are worth. And that's really what we're trying to find here. So for our accountant, we're going to put in here that this individual has a bachelor's degree and years of experience. It said a senior was 4 to 7 years. So we're going to check this. This person's actually on the high end. So we're going to put they have 7 to 9 years of experience. And they actually have 2 employees that report to them. So their direct reports, we'll put 1 to 5. And they actually report to a top management, a senior top manager. And their performance for the past 7 years, they have been rated high on their performance appraisals. And so we're going to check excellent here. And so then you will see that although the median income is $83,990 for this individual, their worth is $86,978. So almost $3,000, excuse me, more than the median income. Okay. The other thing this program allows you to do is you can see what you could do to get a salary increase. It might mean getting a graduate degree, getting a certificate of some type. You can also go in and look at other benefits. You can compare jobs. If you are in the job market, they have job openings. They will also critique your resume. So this is a very robust website. It has a lot of options that, and I've used this many times when preparing for job interviews, and I found it, I actually put in my current job, and it came back about $40 different than what I actually make right now. So kind of made me feel good that I negotiated well the last time I started a new position, and I've been compensated appropriately since then. I'm going to take a brief pause here. Does anybody have any questions about this information?
I see a question. Where does salary.com get their numbers from?
So my understanding is this comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that is a good question. You know what? I might be confusing that with the first one that's listed. No, this one comes from Bureau of Labor Statistics. Let me just and industry surveys. Yeah. I can check that out a little more thoroughly, but I believe this is the one that when I first started using it, because I usually try to stick to things that come directly out of Department of Labor, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics is part of that, and that's where this one came from.
And I'll double check. I'll double check.
Thank you, Charisse. I should have made note of that because that's something I always check. And now I looked at all 3 of them last night, and I don't want to misspeak. But the other thing I want to point out, so if you were applying for a job as a senior accountant and you knew that this was your worth, then you would want to create a range for the employer when they said, what is your range? And this is where you need to think about what you need. So would you be willing to accept slightly lower? Would you be willing to accept, even though you know you're worth 86, would you be willing to accept 83? And that's going to be a very personal decision. Sometimes your budget doesn't allow it. Sometimes you're like, I really need to be paid at least what I'm worth. Sometimes if you've been unemployed for a long time, if there aren't that many, if it's a tight job market and you're like, some money coming in is better than no money, you may have to adjust your figure. So this person might say, you know what, I would be willing to accept 83,000, and then you add somewhere between 10, 12, 15,000. And so you might say, I would be willing to go 83 to 95, somewhere in that range. All right, let's go back to let's see, I'll stop sharing this. Back to to our slides here. All right, so we just did salary.com. The other websites that I want to talk just briefly about, careeronestop.org is a website, employment website run by the Department of Labor. They have a tool called Salary Finder. It's a little bit simpler than salary.com. It doesn't have quite as many bells and whistles. It doesn't allow you to define how many years you've been in the job and the education level. It just divides them into low, medium, and high. So if you're entry level, if you've been in a while, or if you're a very seasoned employee. So it's a little less sophisticated, but a little easier to use. They also have a lot of career information on their education levels and just learning more about what jobs are available. So I always want to recommend this website, as it does come directly out of Department of Labor, and it has videos and handouts on all kinds of topics. The last one is Glassdoor.com, and some of you may be familiar with this website. It is a self-reported website, which means it allows current employees to go in and talk about their employment situation. So when I applied to become a facilitator for the Department of Labor as a contract employee, I went to Glassdoor.com and I found a lot of great information. I found the questions that were going to be asked during the interview because somebody had very graciously posted them. I also learned a little bit about the environment. They talked about the pros of the job, they talked about the cons of the job, and they talked about the pay for the job. And so I had a pretty good idea when they asked me what my range was. I knew how to structure it. A couple cautions about Glassdoor. It is self-reporting. And so sometimes people exaggerate. They aren't always 100% truthful. You don't know what their level of experience was based on what they were being paid. You do get a lot of disgruntled. People are more likely to post when they're unhappy about something than when they love something. So there is a little bit of that going on. But I have found that Glassdoor is one tool. And what I usually recommend is using all three of these. While you're doing your market research, do all three and kind of get a range and then work from that. And that should give you some pretty good intelligence. All right, so we've determined your market value. We have your range. Now let's talk about what you're worth. Not just the dollar amount, but how to negotiate. We need to arm you to negotiate. So it is not enough to go to the negotiation table and say, I need more. That never works. They don't really care what you need. They want to pay you what you're worth. But if you say, you offered me 80, but I think I'm worth at least 85, you need to be able to show them why. And so this is a three-step process. The first thing you're going to do is research the job. So I always say make like a T-chart, 2 columns. First column, you're going to study the job description and make a list of both what they are requiring and what they prefer for education, for skills, certifications, years of experience, any component that they are asking for, requiring, or preferring. Sometimes they say desired. I want you to make a list of those. In the second column, I want you to look at your master resume and make a list of your education, experience, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and match them up to what they're looking for. So if they're saying, we want a minimum of a Bachelor of Science, and you happen to have a master's degree, you put those two on the same line. And then the third step is to compare. And what you're really looking for is, where are the areas where your education and experience and knowledge and skills and abilities exceed what they are looking for in the job requirements. So if their range is, 75 to 85,000 and they've offered you 80, but you exceed on almost every item they're looking for by, they're looking for a 4-year degree, you have a master's degree, they're looking for 1 to 3 years experience, you have 10 years experience, you've done everything they're looking for, plus you've had supervisory experience, then you definitely should be coming in at the high end of that. And you have the justification to ask for that extra amount. Does that make sense to everybody? Or are there any questions about that? It's really about building a case, just like you were in a court of law. You need to have the facts about why you are worth more than the minimum amount of the range.
I did put in the chat the methodology page for salary.com. It sounds like they have their own proprietary method of ongoing data surveys for employers, and the employers supply the data. And we did have a comment in the Q&A that this person gets more than the sample for his senior accountant job, so more than what you cited. So he felt that it seemed accurate for what you were looking at.
Okay, great. Thank you for that feedback. I really appreciate it. All right.
And we did also have one other comment. Is there information available for people who are gig performers or entertainers in terms of what they should ask for?
That's a great question, and I don't know. I would start with any one of these. I would think, depending on what your entertainment is, if you're a musician, I don't know off the top of my head. You would have to go into one of these and do some research. Yeah. That now I'm going to have to do that after this class is over, because now I'm curious. I'm sure there is. I would think particularly Career One Stop. So I'm pretty sure I know Career One Stop comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so I'm sure that, musicians or dancers and things like that are in there. Again, location is going to make a big difference, I'm sure, and also skill level. All right, so let's talk about what is negotiable. So I have just a little word cloud here of all the different types of benefits that you might come across. And I'm sure there are many, many more, but these are kind of the big ones. So salary, of course, we know can be negotiated, bonuses. But then you have all the other benefits like your health and life and dental, vision insurance, a commuter stipend, sick leave, vacation time, childcare, elder care, parking, Metro Pass, stock options, profit sharing, profit matching, or 401k matching, where you contribute and the company also contributes. A company car. Some companies give you tickets to Orioles games, Ravens games, wherever you live in the country, sporting events, trips if you hit certain levels of achievement in sales positions. So there are a whole lot of benefits that companies are offering these days. Some offer free food, snack bars and, breakfast and coffee bars and you name it. But what's negotiable? Is all of it negotiable, or are there some things that you're more likely to be able to negotiate? And so put in the chat box, what do you think is negotiable? What should you be considering when you're putting together your conversation?
salary, bonus, stock options, time off, vacation,
Okay. Yeah.
401k, telework. Very relevant.
Yes, very relevant now. As I typed that, I thought the last time I taught this class was, this topic was probably 4 years ago. And telework and flex time and were not talked about as much, but commute stipend and parking and metro passes were. And now here we are, we've kind of gone the other direction. So everything you've listed are very popular for negotiating. And honestly, what's most important to you. So that's going to be personal. It should be part of the negotiation conversation. So things like flex time. If you're a young parent and your child is in elementary school who goes to school a little bit later, and it's important for you to be home to put your child on the bus or to drop them at school, but you're willing to work a little bit later in the day, then flex time might be part of your negotiation package. There are some things that probably aren't negotiable, only because they are a company policy. For instance, tuition reimbursement. That's probably something that's offered to everybody in the company. And even if you decided, I'm never going to use that, but I'd rather have more salary, they probably aren't going to make that change because it's something they're offering it globally. The big ones are salary, bonuses, profit sharing, 401k, matching, stock options. Insurance is sometimes negotiable. When I took my, not my current position, but one before, I did not need insurance. And so I said to my husband was a federal government employee. I had great insurance through him. And I said, I'm not going to need any health care benefits, but I would like to negotiate to add some of that to my salary. And they were perfectly willing to do that because insurance is quite expensive. And they did not offer me the full amount that the insurance would have cost, but they did offer me a nice raise in salary because I wasn't going to take insurance. Some of the Affordable Care Act things have undone that a little bit, but it is worth having the conversation if you're not going to need insurance. My current company doesn't offer insurance, but instead they pay a healthcare stipend. Works out great for me because I still have insurance through my spouse, and I'm able to just take that money that they intend for you to use to pay a premium, and I can just use it for general expenses. So some of that depends. So once you get the offer, it's important to begin thinking about what else, what's not working here for me, and am I willing to offer up to negotiate? There are a couple things, I call these the non-tangibles, that aren't included here. Can anyone think of other factors that should be considered when negotiating salary? Because I can tell you, it's not always about the money.
So while we wait on the intangibles, we did have a chat post that said cell phone usage on company time is one way to negotiate, is one that you can negotiate paying a portion of the bill.
Ah, okay. Yes. Cell phone, and I guess I would put all equipment, especially now that we're teleworking. Some companies are willing to purchase a laptop for you to use at home, a standing desk, desk chairs, office supplies, cell phones, everything that they used to provide in the office, some companies are now providing at home. Some companies are not, because they're saying you're not spending time and money to commute, and so we're going to expect you to parlay some of that funding into your equipment. Just depends on the company.
We have one posting for an intangible, titles.
Okay, so meaning that you may be willing to take less money if your title has like senior in it. senior accountant, or if it has commands a certain level of respect or responsibility because of the job title.
Yes, the person said exactly. That is
Okay.
what we intended by that.
Okay. Any other intangibles that you need to consider when you go to negotiate? Oops. All right, so I jotted down a couple. Growth potential. Sometimes it is okay to come in below what you think you're worth because there's a lot of potential. And they may talk about that at the interview, that, if you do well within a year, there will be a promotion or a director level position. Job security. I've worked most of my life, when I've worked outside of my own business, I have worked as a government contractor. And one thing about government contracts, there is no job security. You can have I was on one contract that was a 5-year contract, and after 14 months, the Navy decided we're canceling the contract, and we had 30 days and it ended. So yes, I made more per hour than I would have made in a regular job, but I did not have job security. So that's something to consider. Also, credentials. Is working for a company, are they going to pay for you to get some certification, licensing that would set you up well for your next position? Is it going to be a position where you get a lot of great experience that, again, would be good for your next stepping stone? Exposure, networking, all of those, it's hard to put a price tag on, but certainly something to consider, that may be worth taking a little bit less salary for the potential of what could come next. All right, so let's look at how this negotiating works. So you've been through all the interviews. Let me mention this. It is never okay for you to talk about money first. You must wait for them to bring up the topic. Even if during that interview they say, do you have any questions? It is not okay to say, what is the salary range? I know it doesn't seem fair, but it's their house, their rules, and they get to talk about money first. So, real short story, I did an 8-hour interview with a university for a director level position, only to discover at the end of the 8 hours, when they gave me the salary range, that it was a 30% pay cut for me. Now, part of that's on me. I should have done my research. It's a state institution. I probably could have found that information somewhere. It was just a much larger institution than where I worked, and I assumed they were going to pay more money because of more work, but they weren't. So wait for them to bring up money. All right, so you've been through the interview, they make you an offer. First of all, you want it to be in writing. A verbal offer is fine. If they call and make the offer, say, thank you very much, be very gracious, but say, would you mind sending that to me in writing? Because it's very important to make sure that it is a legitimate offer and that it's in writing. And that way it gives you some time to review it. Never accept when it's offered. Always ask for time to consider. Once you get the written offer, look over it. If you have any questions, you can always go back to them to clarify things. But then you move to stage 2, and that's where you decide what is important to you. So I'll use the example for my current position. I had given them my range, and they came back to me and they said, this is a government contract. We are limited on the top end of how much we can pay, and we will bring you in at the maximum amount, but it still leaves a few $1,000s below your lowest limit, my bottom number. And so I had to decide what was important to me. I said, well, can you give me more leave? And they said, we can give you 3 days more leave per year. Okay, not as much as I wanted. I wanted a week, but they said 3 days. Then they came back and told me about the healthcare stipend. So when I added that in, that put me about $1,200 from my bottom number. Then they came back and said, because you're driving from Maryland to Virginia, we're going to give you a commute stipend. And that put me a little above my bottom number. And then they told me that most years there would be a bonus. And there has been for the past 4 years. So in the end, I actually ended up above my bottom number and right about in the middle of my range. But I had to decide what was important to me. Was it about that base number? Was it about the money? Was it about the leave? Was it about the flexibility? Because they did talk about that. You set your hours as long as you get 8 hours in. There was telework available. So you have to decide what's important. And then the third step, this is the one that makes everyone a little bit sick to their stomach. You have to have the conversation. And I say it should be a conversation and not an email if possible. I know we're not fully back face to face, but I would urge you, if you can, when it's time to negotiate, try to set up a face-to-face meeting. So much can be lost in an email. The tone is lost in an email. Phone is better. Still not great because you don't get the facial. Zoom is okay. At least you get the facial recognition. But there's nothing like sitting in the same room and working it out. And the conversation starts with something like this. First of all, gratitude and graciousness. Thank you very much for offering me the position for your senior accountant position. I was very excited to get your email. I've had a chance to go over it. And as much as excited as I am about the job, I'm going to be honest, the salary was a little bit lower than my expectation. And I'm wondering, is there room to negotiate? A question is always less threatening. You're simply asking permission. Can we negotiate this? You want to be polite. You want to be positive. You want them to understand that I really want this job, but we need to work a few things out. And then pick 1 or 2 things that are important to you. So if the salary's okay if you got another week of vacation, or if the salary is just really low and you need that to come up, or you need to know there's going to be a bonus, or you need to know that they will review in 6 months and consider you early for a promotion, whatever it is, that's when you have that conversation. I'm going to pause here because this is the big part, and I need to know what your questions are. Does what I have said so far make sense? Anything?
We've got a yes. We've got
Okay.
a sense. Thank you.
Okay. And, I will encourage you to practice this. This is a skill set. Just like anything else you've ever learned in life, it is a skill set. I grew up in a household where my mother taught me at a very, very young age, if you don't ask, you don't get. I think she regretted teaching me that for the rest of her life, but that's what this is. The worst they can say is no. This is our best and final answer. And then you have the choice. You accept, you decline, or if you need more time, you delay and you ask for more time politely. Now, what I will urge you against doing is trying to pit one company against another, because sometimes you end up with no offers when you do that. And I have seen every example I give you, I have seen play out in real life. It is okay to say, I have other offers that I am considering. Would you be willing to give me another 48 hours before I make my decision? So that's what the delay conversation looks like. What it is not okay to say is, well, I had an offer from company ABC and they're willing to pay me $20,000 more. Are you willing to up your offer to match yours? The human resources world is a very small world. They all go to the same conferences together. They all know each other. And so it is not unlikely for them to pick up the phone and call whichever name you just dropped and say, you're not going to believe what your candidate just said to me. And you may find yourself with no offers. So do not pit one company against another. Now, sometimes a recruiter will say, have you had other offers? And if you say yes, they may ask you, is our offer competitive? And then it's okay to be honest and say, it's $3,000 less than what they offered me. Everything else is pretty equal, but the salary is a little bit low. That is an opportunity for them to come up. I would not name names. I would not give the company's name, especially if you're in the contracting world, because it's very competitive. But it is okay to have a very polite, civil conversation. If you've reached the point where everything they are saying, you agree to it, then it's okay to give a verbal acceptance, ask for any changes that have been made in writing, and they will ask you to sign and return. And there's usually a deadline on that. You want to make sure that you meet the deadline.
We have a question. What if I am better at email negotiation than verbal? I tend to be more empathetic in person, and then I give in.
Okay. Here is the downside to email. And I make that distinction based on a true life case. I had a service member in my class who had gotten an offer and had responded in email. And when I read the email, and he said, I got a call from the recruiter and she seemed to not be very happy with me. And she said no to everything I asked for. And I read his email and then I understood why. I said, your tone was very off-putting. He happened to be an analyst. He was like, well, I was just being factual. And I said, I understand that, but it came off as very demanding. And you're not really in a position to be making demands. And my advice was, you need to call and have a conversation. And you need to say, you may have gotten the wrong impression. I realized when I reread my email, the tone was wrong. And what did he do? He emailed. And the next email he got back was a withdrawal of the offer. So that is my concern with email. If you feel like that is your greatest way to negotiate, make sure that you have somebody who is, fairly impartial and who can read it and make sure that it is gracious and open and polite, and that it has the correct tone that you should have when negotiating. And I also think if you are going to do it in person, it is okay not to accept. If you feel like you would be too conciliatory and that you would give in too easily, it's okay to listen to what they have to say and say, I'm going to need a little bit of time to digest this, and I will get back to you by the end of the day, and decide whether that's going to be by email or phone call. So it's also okay to delay a little bit, an hour or two, until you give it some thought and to make sure that you don't back off too easily. Hopefully that answered your question and explains a little bit why I'm shy about having people use email. You can't feel people's tone. Let's talk about if you are going to decline. If it gets to the bottom line and you just can't bridge the gap between what they're offering and what you feel like you're worth, or in some cases what you feel you need, or if you've had a better offer, You can do this by email. You write a nice decline letter. You thank them for the opportunity, how much you've enjoyed talking with them. You learned a lot more about their industry. You're still intrigued, but you have decided to accept another offer, or you're going to have to decline the offer. And you can say why, because it didn't meet your salary expectations. And then you could leave the door open. You let them know if ever another position arises in your company that would be closer to my salary requirements, I hope that you will consider me for the position and reach out to me. Again, especially with social media, our worlds are very small these days. And you never know when another position will open up, or if the person hears about a position at a third company that they think you'd be a perfect fit for. Networking works. It's how most jobs are found. And so you want to leave the door wide open. So just to recap the process, you get the offer, you decide what's important, you negotiate, you have that conversation, and then you either accept, decline, or delay. If you delay, then you come back and you accept or decline. Okay, let's just talk about what, if you are preparing for negotiation, this is your to-do list. You're going to start by researching the market for each position prior to applying and make sure you know what your range is. And it varies from country, state to state, city to city. Supply and demand have a lot to do with it. And so you want to make sure that you have an accurate number. Make sure you've gone over your education, skills, knowledge, note the areas where you exceed, what's being required, and the preferences. In other words, be willing to have that conversation. And someone mentioned at the beginning about being humble. It is okay to be humble, but it is also okay to sell your skill set. And I think that's where most of us have been taught not to brag about yourself. But if you don't sell your skills to that future employer, nobody else will. So this is not a time to be humble. And for me, what takes away the feeling of bragging is when you back it up with fact. So when you say, I have 5 years of doing workshops with service members. I've seen over 8,000 service members, and I've had 99% of my reviews have been positive. That's not bragging, that's fact. You are backing up the claim with statistics, and it's something you practice. You write it down and you practice out loud saying it, so that when you have the conversation with a future employer, you're simply letting them know a little bit more about you. And then that wraps it up. That's the last one, practice. Practice asking for what you are worth. These same tactics could be used if you want to go in and ask for a raise. You do your research, you find out what you're worth, you look at what you're currently doing in your job and what that would be worth at another company. And sometimes people will say, well, I'm going to have to leave to get a raise. But you know what? Before you leave to get a raise, go to your current boss and ask the question. And sometimes it's just a matter of asking. It's right back to that. You don't ask, you don't get. And so sometimes you need to go in and show them why you're worth more.
We have a couple questions in that regard.
Great.
We have one question about the frequency in negotiating salary, and also the frequency in a full-time versus part-time or internship. Is there a different frequency? We also had a question early on about, what do you do in the executive situation where the person keeps putting you off? When you go and ask to talk to someone and they always push the promotion or increment out to a future event or time.
Oh, let me take that one first. Actually, let me think about that one for a minute. I'm not quite sure I understand the frequency question, meaning how often should you ask for a raise, or is it negotiating for a new job?
I made it a two-part question. The person who asked said, is there a difference in frequency to negotiate salary with part-time internship jobs compared to full-time jobs? And I sort of added to that question because I wonder, what is appropriate? If you're never offered any sort of raise, when is it appropriate to ask for a raise?
Okay. Okay, so let me take that one first. As far as asking for a raise, most companies have some type of a pay increase schedule. In the government, it's usually annual. There's maybe a cost of living, and then sometimes there's what they call a merit raise. So they're a little more scheduled. Private sector may not necessarily have a fixed schedule, but it is certainly something that when you're accepting a job and you're talking about negotiating and benefits, that would be a question I would ask. Once money is on the table, I would want to know up front, how am I going to be evaluated? Are evaluations tied to salary and salary increases? And does that happen on an annual basis or an as needed basis? So hopefully you've gotten that information up front. If you're in a situation where you haven't and you haven't been offered a raise, then I think it's time to have that conversation. And we talked about frequency. When you're going to have a conversation about compensation, you schedule it. You don't just walk into your boss's office and say, hey, can we talk for a minute? I really want to talk to you about a raise. You don't want to blindside them. You want to give them time to, do their research, and you also want to make sure that you go in armed with your research. So if there is not a fixed time where they go over your how well you've done, your performance appraisal, then good timing is always after you've finished a big project, after you've gotten good feedback from a client, on a positive note, and say, and then practice your speech. I've been with the company for 18 months. During that time, I have not had any increased salary. We've just finished this big project. We came in under budget, on time, and we had great feedback from the client. And I would like to have a discussion about whether I can, ask for a merit raise. And so I think it needs to be planful. You can let the person you're going to meet with know that you'd like to talk about compensation and maybe get some feedback. That question's a little hard to answer because every company is different, but it is worth having the conversation. And what I hope this encourages you is that people are having these conversations every day, are getting raises, and are being compensated better because they're willing to ask the question. There are many employers that will not give you a raise if you don't ask for it.
Our accountant posted in the chat to ask before their budgeting cycle.
Ah, that's excellent. Yes. Yes, so they can build it into the budget, because what you don't want to be told is, oh, I wish we'd known. Yeah, that's not in the budget this year. Then you're going to be waiting another year. Now, the thing about part-time and a lot of negotiating too depends on the type of job. There are some hourly jobs that it's simply, you're going to be paid minimum wage. If it's a part-time job, if it's an internship, there is probably a budgeted amount for it, and there's not going to be a lot of negotiating taking place. In a part-time job, though, if you've been there for a year, 6 months, 9 months, and you're taking on more and more responsibility, it all has to be tied to what you're giving them. So if they're getting more than their money's worth from you and you've expanded the job to take on more responsibility and skills and tasks, then it is appropriate to ask for a pay increase. The higher you go on the ladder, if you're a salaried position, then there's more latitude for negotiation. And I want to tell one quick story. I call this the tale of two analysts. And I was shocked when this happened. I had two service members, both had been in about 4 years, neither had a college degree. They were enlisted in the military, both were getting out, both worked in cybersecurity. Both applied to the same company. One of them was offered $90,000. He's thinking, I have a high school diploma and I am being offered $90,000. That's more money than anyone in my family has ever made in a year. And he accepted the position. I happen to know the recruiter who offered him the position. She said to me, I was so sad because I could have paid him 110, but he didn't ask. I had $20,000 to negotiate with, but he didn't ask. And our company policy is if you don't ask, you don't get. The second person in my class came to me during the class and said, I've gotten this offer for $90,000. I had the prior knowledge. I said to him, what does your research tell you? He says, well, everyone I've talked to said I should really be making between 100 and 120 in this position. And I said, then I recommend that you negotiate. We talked, I schooled him on what to say. He called the recruiter. They had a phone conversation. He said, I'm very interested in the position, but according to my research, the salary is a bit low. Is there room to negotiate? She said, I will get back to you. He came back to me. I started to sweat. I wanted to call my husband and say, we may have to adopt this, 23-year-old if this doesn't work out. She called him back and she said, how does 110 sound? He said, that sounds great. Here's the sad part about that story. Two identical skill sets, one being paid $20,000 less. It will take him a long time if he ever makes up that difference. He will not make up the difference in that company. He will need to change jobs and he will need to know what his worth is before he accepts the next position. So I tell you that to say, be paid what you're worth. One, money's not everything, but it is a validation that what you're doing is worth being compensated fairly. And it does help with attitude, especially on those days when you're doing something that's not particularly fun or glamorous. You at least have the knowledge that you are being paid what you're worth, either in salary, time off, flex time, whatever, exposure, experience, etc. And that's why I'm passionate about this. I have a quote here because I think the number one thing that keeps us from negotiating is fear. John F. Kennedy says, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. It is a skill set. It can be learned and practiced and then executed. And that's what I want to encourage you to do. I will take any questions. I am on LinkedIn, so if you would like to link with me, please send me a personalized message with your request and remind me where you heard my information, and I would be happy to connect with you. And then the last thing I'd like you to put in the chat box, in addition to any questions, are what will you do differently as a result of attending this workshop? Because it is great to sit and get new information, but if we don't put it into action, have we really learned anything? So what are you going to do differently in the next, let's say in the next 30 days as a result of this workshop?
Did you have any additional tips or helpful ideas for the person who schedules time to discuss the topic, but the person is always pushing it off or saying we're waiting for a future event or incrementing out the discussion?
Right. So it's interesting. I think the reason that happens, it could be a couple of things. One, it could be that there truly isn't any more money to be given. And so the person pushes off the conversation because they don't want to tell you, no, there's no more money, for fear that you will leave. So it's a delay tactic. I'm very big on looking at why. The other piece of it is sometimes, and you will find this, employers are just as fearful of having negotiating conversations as employees and applicants are. It's not a comfortable conversation for anybody. And so sometimes they will simply, if they're non-confrontational and they really don't want there to be any conflict, they will push it off. So I think the way to handle that is you have to decide, do I need to look for a new job? Do I need to provide the ultimatum? Either we have this conversation or I will begin looking for other employment. Or are you willing to stay and not have the conversation? Comes down to that. And I think, you know, I'm pretty plain spoken. I have learned to have the difficult conversations, regardless of how sick it makes me feel in my stomach, because I would rather have a no answer than no answer. You know, I'd rather have someone tell me no than have me hanging in limbo. Let me know where I stand. There's not going to be any more money. Okay, if I want more money, I'm going to have to go somewhere else. Not saying I would telegraph that to your current employer, because some employers, once they hear that, things start to go downhill. But I would get pretty firm and say, it is important to me that we have this conversation soon, and maybe put a timeline on it. Hopefully that helps.
We had one response to your question. Oh, that person did answer, thanks, that really helps. I plan to schedule another meeting in 30 days.
Great.
And then we had another response. I will look for opportunities to negotiate on any job offers rather than just accepting or declining.
Good. That's what I like to hear. That's what I like to hear.
And we don't have anything else in the Q&A or the chat.
Great.
I'm just.
It has been my pleasure to share this information with you. As I said, I've given you some resources, the salary.com, the salary finder on careeronestop.org. They have every topic you can think of employment related is available there, and it's sound research. It's a credible source. So I encourage you to do your research, step out boldly, have those difficult conversations, and be paid what you are worth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. I will be in touch with everyone regarding the recording. And I did place a link to the survey, and I will email that as well, because we do welcome your feedback. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Jayne. It's excellent.
Thank you, Charisse. Take care.